broad of this entire story. So what we're going to discuss today is going to be a quick breakdown of the news itself, which has just come out at the beginning of February, the beginning of this month, which pertains to a particular study, which we'll get into. We're going to provide some of the context. Both of these issues are relatively well known. You can find this in the news. We'll give you our own breakdown of the key points in this. But then we're going to have a unique presentation of some of the background, some of the motivation behind this entire program, which again is really an exclusive story that only LaRouche PAC has. And then just briefly touch upon what real science means in the future, what it will mean to have a real science of climate change in direct opposition to this junk being put out, this what is really fake news now in the name of science. So, some people are calling this Climategate too. This came out in the Daily Mail, where they had a discussion with a whistleblower from NOAA who came out and exposed the bad practices behind a very particular and important study that got a lot of headlines in 2015. So just to read one of their opening paragraphs or opening sentences in this expose, this article, and again, you can find this online and read it yourself. The Daily Mail reads, NOAA breached its own rules on scientific integrity when it published the sensational but flawed report aimed at making the maximum possible impact on world leaders, including Obama and Cameron, at the UN Climate Conference in Paris in 2015. So we'll get into exactly what the study referenced here is in a second. But just to highlight the key points, the accusations made in this Daily Mail article and by this whistleblower, they are saying that this study was based on misleading and unverified data. They said this is a preliminary and unverified version of a data set that was then used and published all over the world. This particular data set was never subjected to NOAA's own internal evaluation process. They have a system set up to verify data, verify that the data being presented is correct. And this particular study never went through that process. And we'll get into why that's important in a second. Beyond that, none of the data was properly archived. So people talk about the quote-unquote scientific method, and that's another issue to get into, but one of the basic tenets of that is the ability for others to go back and reproduce your results, either do new experiments or go back to the raw data itself and double check that somebody derived an accurate representation of that raw data. Well, if the data is not archived, that's now impossible. And it was also accused that NOAA overrode objections and basically silenced objections to the bad practices just listed here when they were raised by this particular whistleblower. And beyond that, it's then raised, was there an explicit cover-up of this, what really could be called a fraudulent effort? NOAA refused congressional subpoenas. Certain people in the Congress had a sense that there was something very fishy about this study. They subpoenaed, they wanted information, they wanted to talk to the people involved. NOAA refused, they just didn't allow that. And then NOAA then claimed in response to some of this heat that, well, there was no internal concerns raised. No one within NOAA raised any concerns about this study. We didn't have anyone inside that was saying this is problematic, which is now not lie, because this whistleblower himself explicitly raised those concerns. So they lied about that. And then to top it all off, what this guy says really drove him to come out and blow the whistle on this thing was the icing on the cake was then the computer that contained the original data. The last records you could look at to check the validity of this study suffered a complete failure and is no longer accessible. And at this point, this guy said, I have to speak out on this thing. This is ridiculous. Now, who is this whistleblower? This is not just some nobody. This is Dr. John Bates is a long-established senior scientist in this field. He has a 40-year career in meteorology and climate science at NOAA. He just retired last year, 2016. He spent the last 14 years of his career at the Climatic Data Center as one of the leading scientists, as a principal scientist. He's received pretty significant awards. He received an award from NOAA in 2004. And in 2014, this is rather important, he received a U.S. Department of Commerce gold medal for visionary work in the acquisition, production, and preservation of climate data records. So this was his specialty, and he actually came up with some of the specific methods used to assess and properly archive and properly store data. These procedures that were explicitly not followed by this study being exposed. So he is somebody with the highest credentials to make these accusations. He's, again, long-established career in these areas specifically. And he's the guy who basically wrote the book on how you, and was awarded for writing the book by the Obama administration, for how you properly archive, preserve data so you can have, continued valid assessments into the future, and double checking and, what have you. Practices that were not followed by this study. So what's the study? This is the name of the study, Possible Artifacts of Data Biases in the Recent Global Surface Warming Hiatus. Now, when we get to the context, we'll say what this is in a second. But this is the study that came out in 2015, which again, which basically showed, they looked back at prior data, reworked it, adjusted it, quote unquote, and said, oh, what do you know? We've had a faster rate of warming in the past couple decades than we'd realized. Now, this was a big deal because this came out, one, in opposition to many other studies that were showing contrary results, that warming had slowed, if not stopped, in the last 2 decades. And this was creating a lot of consternation going into the Paris UN Climate Summit in 2015. So lo and behold, right before the climate summit, in the period leading up to it, this new paper comes out from NOAA, has the official stamp of the, some of the supposedly the most rigorous government agencies involved in this stuff, as, supposedly totally authoritative, saying, don't worry about any of that stuff. We re-looked at the data. There were some mistakes. We adjusted some stuff. And what do you know? The warming has actually been much higher than we had thought, we had realized. And this study is now, and a lot of people when that came out really, really doubted the validity of this. I mean, just from the context and the timing alone, this thing stank. Let alone the fact that it directly contradicted many other studies and assessments. So now we have this guy, this internal official from NOAA, coming out and giving some inside scoop on the process that led to such a pathetic and bad study. Again, the data they used was never subjected to the internal review process in NOAA. None of the data was archived properly. The data is now lost due to mysterious computer failure. NOAA officials suppressed and overrode objections from this guy, Dr. Bates, other people. NOAA refused subpoenas on the subject of this study, and NOAA then claimed there were no internal concerns raised, despite the fact this eminently qualified person did raise concerns. Now, the study itself relied on some pretty shoddy data to come up with these results. For measurements of surface ocean records, they ended up with tripling the warming trend over the past couple decades. So what they came up with was 3 times higher than any other warming trend measured from ocean records prior. And the way they did that was they actually relied less on certain specialized buoy systems, which are out there to measure the temperature of the water around different oceans around the world. Something that's set up to try and get consistent, regular measurements of ocean temperatures. They kind of pushed those aside and they favored measurements from ship intakes, which as soon as this came out, people were saying this is nuts. A ship itself, it has engines, it has motion, it's generating heat from its own activity. It's then intaking water, and then you're measuring that water for the temperature of the ambient ocean. in a system that itself is generating heat, that's ridiculous. I mean, maybe you could use that data if you didn't have anything else and there was a rough, you needed some rough assessment of something, or if it was only relative to that data over time, maybe you could look at some trends. But to take that over buoy data as some authoritative presentation of ocean temperatures is just ridiculous. But that's what they did. Again, didn't go through the eternal review. The data is not available to cross-check in any kind of significant way now. And they just put out their graph, their results, and said this is authoritative, and the media ran with it. Talk about fake news. And there were a few other problems. The software they used, it was a little unclear in the articles I read, either to assess the land surface data or possibly to combine land and ocean data, which you have to do if you're trying to come up with one metric for the whole average global temperature. But the software they were using for that was demonstrated to be very problematic. The software itself used to process that data was clearly had some major bugs in it because it wouldn't give consistent results. When you added on more recent data and then reran the assessment, it would actually significantly change what the past was supposedly. So somehow new data added to the system was affecting what the past records were presented as. Now, that new data didn't actually change the past. It showed a clear flaw in the way the algorithm was running, such that when averaging these different data sets and many different measurements from around the world, it was just not working properly and wouldn't even give consistent results. Another problem, it ignored satellite measurements, which we'll get into in a little bit. So the clear accusation was this was a shoddy study based on shoddy data that was rushed through, wasn't even allowed to go through the full proper internal publication process or assessment and validation process. And then it was presented to the entire world in the lead up to this UN Paris Climate Summit, where there was a major push to get governments to agree on, carbon reduction agreements. So it was clearly politically motivated. And, just to show a little bit more in the context, well, this is the results of the adjustment themselves. So this is what the study did, basically. They took the global surface temperature, combining ocean and land records from 2001 to 2015. That had been already assessed. There was already a data set that provided the assessment of what those temperatures were year to year, month to month. And then they went through and adjusted it, and this is the effect. It basically ended up with a doubling of the warming rate over this period. And you see flipping back and forth here between the pre-adjusted and the post-adjusted measurements. Now this might, it might not seem like a huge difference. I mean, it's double, so that's significant. But, if you look at the degrees, these are degrees Celsius change relative to an earlier baseline average. It might not look like much, but this makes a very, very big deal when you get into the discussion of then taking these trends out a century, which is what these people do, and say, over a century, this means we're going to warm this much or that much, and allows people to then, make certain deductions on what effect supposedly CO2 is going to have based on asserting these kind of relations on what effect it's supposedly having already. So if you can make it look like CO2 is already having a greater effect than it actually is, you can argue it's going to have a greater effect in the future, and therefore shut down all your coal plants, build a bunch of solar panels, and cause mass poverty in the world, which would be the results of that. But for the context, the reason why they were so motivated to do this, make this adjustment, was that there has been and there still is a major growing realization that this issue, the issue of what some people call how sensitive the climate is to CO2, how much does the climate actually respond to increasing CO2 levels, is actually very likely a hell of a lot less than what these guys are claiming. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It's going to trap some heat. But is it going to, warm the global average temperature, whatever exactly that means, by 0.2 of a degree over a century, or is it going to be 10 degrees? You get Al Gore out there saying we're going to have melting ice caps, New York's going to be flooded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. the reason they make those crazy extreme statements is because they claim, it's all dependent upon this claim that CO2 is, that the atmosphere is highly, highly sensitive to CO2. Well, if that were the case, now we should be seeing some of the most significant warming because we're having a greater and greater rate of output of CO2 into the atmosphere from human activity. I mean, that's true, that's known. The total amount of CO2 isn't just going up, it's going up at a higher rate because mankind is developing, where, populations are growing, they're getting power, they're getting electricity, they're driving cars. These are all good things. And we're getting more CO2 in the atmosphere. So the recent, decades of CO2 levels are the highest, obviously in recorded human history as far as the records show. But then if you look at certain measurements, in particular satellite measurements of atmospheric temperature on Earth over the past 20 years, you get something that really is rather alarming to this global warming scare crowd, which is that the average temperature is pretty much flatlined for about 20 years. This was sometimes called the global warming pause, which, even that word is kind of loaded because it indicates that the warming is still going to continue. This is just a temporary pause. Some people are calling it a hiatus. What it definitely is a flat line. It's a flat line averaged out over these years. The trend leveled off. Again, the years when we've had the greatest increase, the greatest amount of CO2 release, human CO2 release in the atmosphere. And these are actually two different assessments by independent groups of the satellite measurements, and how, it's not necessarily a simple task of deriving average global temperature records from satellite observations. But it is possible, and it's done, and at least with this you have a consistent data set. And with that consistent data set, again, two different groups analyzing it, and you can see some slight variations in their results. But overall, the overall structure is very similar, and the trend is the same. And some people have claimed, the satellite measurements are no good, but these have been validated with balloon in situ measurements. So the satellite assesses some measurement of what it thinks the temperature of the atmosphere is based on the methods used to analyze the satellite data. And then many times, people have independently put up balloons into that part of the atmosphere, measured the temperature directly in situ in that part of the atmosphere, and it's the same. So, these are independently validated and consistent and good, and they show flat line, no warming trend for 20 years. Here's another presentation of that data over a little bit longer, going back to the mid-70s, comparing, again, both of these two. Obviously the trend here is a little more smoothed, but both of these two assessments of satellite data against what is predicted by an average of many, many, many different models. And this is a graphic we produced that's a little bit cleaner. You can find another graphic that has each model's own prediction in it. And you get this kind of spaghetti spread of different predictions by the models, but they all go higher than what the records have actually showed. So if you take the models, you run them from an earlier date with the level of CO2 increase, and you show what they would predict under those conditions, you see that the actual measurements fall far below what any of these models were predicting. So you have this clear failure of the models. You have this breaking between the correlation between warming trend and CO2 release, and this was getting a lot of publicity. People were really getting, some sense, and even the UN, the IPCC itself, while not citing a straight flat line, was itself admitting in its own official reports that this period, late 90s to 2014, 2015, was a significantly lower warming trend than the prior period. So they didn't quite have it as a flat line, but even they admitted that the rate of increase based on their measurements was, or the data they were working with, was significantly less than the prior period. So whatever you have, there was a clear assessment and indication from many sources that the warming trend had radically slowed down, if not completely leveled off. So that didn't sound good going into this Paris climate summit when they had to scare the crap out of people and say, if we don't do something now, we're going to boil over and everything's going to melt. So boom, here you had this study that came out. And this was publicized everywhere. This was all over the media. This is, excellent example of fake news. Totally shoddy study, bad data, was not allowed to go through internal review. The data is not available now to see, so no one can double check the results. NOAA officials under Obama suppressed any attempt to let any investigations in this claim. There was no internal dissent, all lies. And this was just ran all over the media. There's no global warming pause. There's no slowdown. The warming trend has been as great as it was before. We have to act now, blah, blah, blah. So this was clearly a major propaganda effort based on shoddy evidence. And now it's good we have somebody who is on the inside. Again, most people who had any sense, who saw this when it came out, just from the context and the timing, said this stinks. And then you look at the data and the methods, and people were already saying this is bunk, this is crap. This not only does it disagree with other assessments, but you can see right away they're using methods that are no good. And now we have somebody who's established on the inside, eminently qualified to make these accusations, giving the inside scoop of the internal corruption and process that went into this fake news in the name of science. So this is a big deal. Some people are calling this Climategate too. This should really be spread far and wide as a death blow to this claim of a coming global warming catastrophe. So this is certainly very, very significant. Well, what we want to look at a little bit is, some of the broader context, because, some stuff is missed just in the scandals. And, just to make the point, we should really ask, who are the real science deniers? Because, these are serious and difficult questions, and people who question, the validity of the claim that we're coming to a catastrophe or a catastrophic result from human CO2 emissions are often called science deniers. They say the science is settled, and they use these loaded phrases that are beyond ridiculous, saying that, these people just don't believe in science, they deny science, they don't listen to science. Well, we just went through a whole story. Where's the science in that? They present the graph. They don't tell you where the graph came from. They don't tell you what methods went into the graph. They hide the data that went into the graph, and the computers mysteriously crash when you try and get into the data behind the graph. But if you question the graph, you're called a science denier. It's absolutely absurd. And the worst part of it is, in one sense, in addition to the fact that, this could have genocidal results if you have this kind of rapid global clampdown on human ability to emit CO2 reductions, which is probably the most catastrophic effect of this whole policy, which is intentional when we get into that. But the other thing that's completely disgusting is the bastardization and the real destruction of the idea of science. People are told science is not you coming to know how these claims are valid. Science is these people saying, this is what's true, you believe us, don't question us. If you question us, you're a science denier. How is that science? Anybody who really is in this field, the reason I'm displaying this animation, this is a graphic of the course of 1 year, just 1 year looped over and over again, based on, integrated NASA satellite imagery, get rid of the clouds and do different assessments of the data. And if you can see clearly here, you see obviously the snowfall ebbing and flowing with winter coming and going. You see the green. I love this region in Africa. You can see the greening shifting with the seasons, up and down, up and down. And, the person who produced this said it looks like a heartbeat to the planet Earth. And it really is, it's an amazing animation, an amazing depiction of what the planet does in the course of just 1 year, let alone year-to-year variations. So the question is, how do you take this and get one number? That's not an absolute, super settled, precise assessment. There is a lot of room for choices in what measurements you use, what stations you use to measure, what your method is for integrating those measurements. How do you decide how to add up which ocean measurements, which land surface measurements, you have huge issues with what's called the heat island effect, where a lot of these land-based stations were placed on what used to be the outskirts of cities or metropolitan areas. Now those areas have expanded, so now you have concrete roads and towns and houses of urban development surrounding these stations that take measurements, and it's absolutely clearly established and known that urbanization creates an island of higher temperature. So if we're still using those records from those stations in urban areas, you're going to get a higher trend because you're measuring a heat island effect, not the actual temperature of the Earth. So, and what some leading people who have really stepped out on this have said, in one sense, even the rate of warming these guys are claiming really in a lot of cases is not even outside of the error range in trying to get one serious solid estimate. And as you can see, a lot of the estimates as we looked at from satellite data, from other data, has generally shown the idea that this is definitely not moving at the rate, not warming at the rate that it was claimed. Again, there's some variation in there, obviously. Maybe it's warming a little bit, maybe it's flatlined. But, some idea that we know this to absolute precision. NOAA puts out this graph and you're supposed to believe it with no questions asked is really, that's the denial of science. That's the destruction of science. But what we have here at LaRouche PAC, and what Lyndon LaRouche has really led the fight on, is a deeper expose of where this comes from. It's not just these scandals. It's not just these people, who have careers that depend upon getting money for this stuff. Some of that's true. Some of that's involved in the motivation on some of these things. But there's a deeper ideological motivation that comes from a very specific historical source and really still permeates the field. And I thought this was one very insightful event that helps to demonstrate that or get that across. Some of you, our viewers, might have seen this, maybe not. There was a letter written to Obama, the Attorney General, the Obama science advisor, Holdren, who will come back up again in a couple minutes, in September 2015, supporting a call to use the RICO Act to investigate organizations that are, quote unquote, supposedly denying the science, or to say it honestly, who are posing valid arguments and questioning the claims being made. And as we just went through, there's ample reason to question the claims being made. When you have studies like this NOAA study, headed up by this guy, Karl, behind this adjustment study, claiming to, which is, again, based on all this fraudulent data, internal corruption in NOAA to suppress any investigation of it, etc. But then on the other side, you have these, this is some 20 professors headed up by this guy, who claimed that the government should be using the RICO precedent, the RICO Act, to investigate and come down on anybody with the authority and the power of the government under this, very particular capabilities provided by the RICO Act, to investigate anybody who's, claiming to question or investigate or dissent against what's everyone's being told you're supposed to believe as the prominent opinion. Now, it's definitely caused a big consternation, a big stir. And, one kind of funny irony in the whole thing that came out pretty quickly was that the lead author of this letter, this guy Shukla of George Mason University, so he's calling on the government to run investigations into people questioning the global warming scare under the claim that they're doing this just for their own profit motives, and they have an inherent corruption, and they're using their claims to investigate this, to look at the data more closely, to question the narrative being put out. The assertion is that they're doing that just to make a profit and therefore they deserve special investigation and crackdown from the government. Well, it turns out this guy himself has been running a nonprofit funded with government money where between him and his wife he gets $500,000 a year to run a relatively small nonprofit which is just pumping out more propaganda on the global warming scare. So you want to talk about irony, this guy here, he's the one in the position making, over the course of a few years, millions of dollars running this nonprofit, getting government money and just continuing to crank out propaganda on the global warming scare. But then he's coming out accusing anybody questioning the work he and others are doing as inherently corrupt and deserving government investigation. That's what was covered in the news. We have a little bit of a more exclusive insight into this particular scenario, which I think highlights the key point that we want to really get into if you want to understand this thing in totality. A leading so-called climate skeptic, somebody who has a scientific background, is highly qualified to actually get into these matters, wrote a personal letter to not the lead author, but another professor, a well-established professor associated with this group. And he asked him, I'm a scientist, you're a scientist, I have a different scientific view, and I can present my evidence on that. But you're now saying that the government should be investigating me under corruption laws due to my scientific views that I can demonstrate. That really is an alarming precedent and really a danger to science. It was the general sentiment he expressed in this private letter that a few of us were given access to by somebody involved in this whole discussion process. And the response of one of the signers to this letter calling for RICO investigation into people challenging the global warming narrative, the response, I think, is clinical and opens the door to a real insight into where this really comes from, this whole push from the highest level, from the top down. The response to that, well-worded, clear point of concern from one scientist to another did not mention climate data, did not mention the global warming theory. He did not say, I think your science is wrong, I can prove it, I'm right, and I think I can demonstrate that that people opposing this assertion are corrupt and not following the scientific data. He didn't say anything to that effect. His argument in response to that accusation was that he believed that the world is heading to a crisis because we are going beyond our carrying capacity on the planet, and therefore immediate action is to be taken. I thought we were talking about climate and CO2, and a particular argument about what effects CO2 might or might not have on the climate and on global warming. When pressed on that issue, the response was, well, my concern is that human beings are overcoming the carrying capacity of the earth and we need to take drastic action. There's your motivation. There's the ideology behind this entire global warming scare. Whether every scientist involved expresses it or not is another question. But where this comes from, the origins of this entire scare story lie in that Malthusian limits to growth, overpopulation ideology that has been imposed on America and much of the West really increasingly since the 60s. And if you really want to go to the origins of this entire Malthusian ideology, and Malthus is an important reference point because this is heavily British and British imperial ideology. If you really want to go to the origins of this, you have to go to the immediate post-World War II period and look at the characters involved in really founding and launching the entire modern environmentalist movement and the radical environmentalist movement. You have people like Julian Huxley, Prince Philip, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, Prince Philip being the royal consort to the current Queen of England. These are the people that founded the World Wildlife Foundation, one of the initial and leading and most important environmental organizations in the history of the environmental movement. They organized the bankrolling of that organization and many others, and they really kicked off this entire thing. Who are these people? I don't want to spend a long time on this, and we've written and exposed this in detail, rather exclusively, in LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review magazine and in other locations. But these people were literally pro-Nazi. They were literally pro-eugenics. They believed in this whole eugenics idea, this whole Hitler race science idea. And this was the ideology at behind the founding of what became the environmentalist movement. Julian Huxley was a major, major proponent of eugenics before World War II and after World War II. And in his founding document as the initial head of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization, he literally wrote in the founding document to that despite the bad name that eugenics has gotten after the expose of Hitler's activities, we have to still pursue and begin to gradually make this a thinkable option again. So he was literally in 1948, after World War II, was promoting the revival of eugenics in his position at the UN. He became a key person involved in the formation of the World Wildlife Fund and their activity. Prince Philip himself and his family is loaded with Nazi connections, very much tied into the faction of the British monarchy and establishment that had brought Hitler to power, supported Hitler, and only turned against Hitler once he decided not to attack the Soviet Union first, but went west first instead. But there was massive support in these layers in the British establishment for Hitler and the Nazi movement. In reality, if you want to get into it, they played a critical role in creating this entire fascist movement. It's only when it went the wrong way that they turned back to Roosevelt in the U.S. and, went the other way and went after these guys. But he never abandoned that view. He never abandoned that view towards mankind. I mean, this is the guy who, on multiple occasions, has stated that if he could be reincarnated as anything in the world, if he could die and come back as anything, any other form of life, his number one choice, which he's stated multiple times, would be to come back as a particularly deadly pathogen, a deadly virus that could solve the world overpopulation problem for human beings. This is a guy who has openly connected the idea of culling herds of animals to how you manage human populations. Again, founder of the World Wildlife Fund, key player in creating the World Wildlife Fund and promoting it. This other individual, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, again, Nazis. There's clear and very solid evidence that he was actually a intelligence asset of the Nazi SS for some period of time, including allegations that have come out that he was involved in, or at least allowed certain processes of shuffling Nazis out of Europe as the war was ending, ensuring they had safe travels to different places in the world, indicating that he continued in that role as a high-level intelligence collaborator with the Nazi movement. Founder of World Wildlife Fund, founder of the Bilderberg Group, founder of the 1001 Club, which is an organization to finance the bankrolling of the environmentalist movement. So this is the context. This is the background. This is the exclusive story that LaRouche and his associates have pulled together on the real origins and motivation behind the environmentalist movement. So when you have this kind of activity, and when scientists who are supposedly objective just go by the data, when they're pressed on the issue, and it's shown that they fall back to this idea that, well, the real issue is that mankind is a scourge on the planet and we need to do something about overpopulation. That tells you something about the continuation of this ideology permeating what's now this whole climate change, global warming scare. Again, not every scientist on lower levels might, be fully bought into this ideology, but this is just a clinical expression of that kind of origin and motivation really behind this climate change scare, just as a front, as a propaganda campaign, to push this Malthusian population reduction, population control, eugenics, pro-Nazi really ideology. I want to highlight one other step in this process. Again, this is some exclusive material that the LaRouche organization pulled together in the past. So you had these characters really starting the modern environmentalist movement, huge propaganda on overpopulation, running out of food supplies, et cetera, but all around a number of scares centering around the same Malthusian eugenics ideology. Then in 1975, you had a particularly interesting conference entitled on the subject, "The Atmosphere, Endangered and Endangering." And this was really where you had the beginning of the focus on the climate as a particular area to build up scare stories in support of this population reduction ideology. As was stated by one of the co-authors in the proceedings, the main purpose of this conference is to anticipate the call that will be made on scientists and leaders of government regarding the need to protect the atmospheric environment before these calls are made. So they had some sense that the atmosphere was going to be a battleground over the supposed claims of effects of human activity, and they wanted to pull together leading excellent scientists to discuss to make sure they're prepared to respond to the calls of government and the calls of others regarding this issue of coming concerns over the climate. And who were some of the leading participants? Margaret Mead organized the whole conference, a radical proponent of population reduction, somebody who expresses, the deep anthropology ideas that really connect straight back to the whole eugenics ideology, but just in a new form. Terrible person. John Holdren, who under Obama was Obama's chief science advisor. He was a notable attendee of this 1975 conference. He was a protege of Paul Ehrlich, one of the big proponents of this population scare idea that population growth is the biggest problem on the planet and needs to be reined in. Author of The Population Bomb, one of the more popular presentations of that whole ideology. John Holdren, this is somewhat infamous and well known, especially hit the internet big time when Holdren came in as Obama's chief science advisor. But Holdren co-authored a book with Ehrlich and Ehrlich's wife entitled Ecoscience, Population, Resources, and Environment. And in that book, they just went through all the possible means you can utilize to control human population growth, because again, this is the number one issue according to these people. Mandatory abortions, so the government or whatever agencies can decide who needs to have an abortion and who doesn't. Mass sterilization, references to putting sterilization drugs into the drinking water of certain populations. I mean, we could go on. You could find this book, quotes from this book, all available online. But again, this radical Malthusian population reduction ideology. And this guy became Obama's science advisor. He was, and the Daily Mail also notes, not to get into connectos, but the Daily Mail also notes that he has a particular long-standing relationship with the lead author of this fraudulent NOAA paper, which is at the center of this scandal. Small world when you get into it. Anyway, another participant in this 1975 conference, launching the focus on climate as a front for a Malthusian ideology. George Woodwell, another avid proponent of population reduction. Stephen Schneider, we'll focus on him in a second, became a key, very important person pushing the whole global warming scare very hard and very early on. Now, I want to read a quote from Margaret Mead's keynote to this conference, because I think this really illustrates what we're dealing with and should bring back to mind immediately the fraudulent study that's now been exposed by this NOAA whistleblower. So in her keynote to this entire conference, Margaret Mead said, "At this conference, we are proposing that before there is a corresponding attempt to develop a quote-unquote law of the air, the scientific community advise the United Nations and individual powerful nation states or aggregations of weaker nation states, and attempt to arrive at some overview of what is presently known about hazards to the atmosphere from man-made interventions, and how scientific knowledge, coupled with intelligent social action, can protect the peoples of the world from dangerous and preventable interference with the atmosphere upon which all life depends." Okay, so again, that's the stated intention of the conference, to get ready for the atmosphere and human effects on the atmosphere to be a battleground, again, but in the context of a group of radical Malthusian depopulation advocates. And then she goes on and really lets the cat out of the bag. So she says, again, in her keynote to this gathering of ostensibly leading scientists, many of which are just radical Malthusian nut jobs, she says, "What we need from scientists, i.e. you at this conference, are estimates presented with sufficient conservatism and plausibility, but at the same time as free as possible from internal disagreements that can be exploited by political interests, that will allow us to start building a system of artificial but effective warnings, warnings which will parallel the instincts of animals who flee before the hurricane." Think about this NOAA study by Karl et al. In the context of what Mead is defining as the role of scientists in the context of supposed concerns about the atmosphere from human activity. Plausible and free from internal disagreements. Does that sound like this recent study? Does that sound like NOAA saying to the U.S. Congress, there is no internal dissension around this study, when in fact there was? So silencing any internal conflicts or disagreements. Estimates that are plausible. Does that sound like science? When people are called science deniers for questioning particular studies or questioning particular claims, when in fact it is shown that many of these claims are outright terrible, terrible studies, if not outright fraudulent, depending on what you can demonstrate about the intention of the participants or the producers of these studies. And yet, the call to action that launched this whole thing was premised on the need for estimates that are plausible. But then what's she end with? What's the last part of this quote? What do they need these plausible estimates for? To start building systems of artificial but effective warnings? Warnings which parallel the instincts of animals who flee before the hurricane? Who are the animals? It's you. It's the general population. The role of scientists is to create mass scare stories that force people to go along with the objectives predefined. Come up with plausible estimates, silence any internal disagreement, and start using that to build up in the population artificially created mass reactions that parallel how animals flee natural disasters. That's Margaret Mead's, neo-eugenics anthropologist view about human beings and the human population. That's how you treat them. That's how you manage people in this Malthusian eugenics type view of the nature of mankind, which is really the fundamental issue underlying this entire thing. So that was her keynote to this entire conference. Now, again, one of the leading participants at the time was this Schneider. And he's worth also, and in this context, it's worth highlighting his career coming out of this conference. He became a early heavy advocate of the claim of global warming in the 80s. So he was one of the first people to jump on board saying this CO2 thing, it's going to ruin the planet, we're going to have a catastrophic warning, we have to do something about this. So he jumped on this quick, and he was pushing it hard. He was the founder and editor of a premier journal called Climate Change. He was involved in co-authoring literally hundreds of papers on climate change. He was a coordinating lead author of the IPCC's 2001 Third Assessment Report. So, went all the way to the level of a significant individual in crafting the whole IPCC process, which had been heavily, heavily laden with propaganda. Now, echoing Mead's call on the role of scientists in this scare story, we have a quote from Stephen Schneider from 1989 from an article in Discover magazine, where he says, on the one hand, as scientists, we are ethically bound to the scientific method, in effect promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but. On the other hand, we are not just scientists, we are human beings as well. We need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination. That, of course, entails getting loads of media coverage. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention about any doubts we might have. This double ethical bind we frequently find ourselves in cannot be solved by any formula. Each of us has to decide what the right balance is between being effective and being honest. So it sounds like he took Margaret Mead's marching orders quite literally and clearly and carried them into his career and his outlook in this thing. Again, scare stories, scenarios, simplified scare scenarios, dramatic statements, not mentioning doubts or questions. Does this sound like science? Science pertaining to that affects the livelihood of the entire planet, of billions of people? Because we're dealing with access to affordable energy when much of the world is in absolute energy poverty. The balance between being effective and being honest. I think Karl et al. Showed their demonstration of their idea of what their balance is between effective and honest in their study that's now been exposed as a total fake news propaganda campaign. Anyway, so I think this is important context to then, review these studies. So we have this Karl et al. Study, which by the book is following what Mead laid out, what Schneider laid out, which is pushing these scare stories on the claims of climate catastrophes, but really all originating and motivating fundamentally from this Malthusian outlook. That's the motive. That's what's driving this entire thing from the highest levels historically and today. So again, totally shoddy studies put out, spread all over the media. This is science. You believe this or you're a denier. Total crap. But there's a whole history of this thing. You take, I'm just going to cite a couple examples in this same context. This Karl et al. Study was not the first such adjustment that's raised many questions and concerns about the validity of all this stuff these guys are doing. You look at what the U.S. NOAA and NASA had presented publicly as the record of United States average temperature for the history from 1880 to 2000. So this is what is our official government record being presented to the public of what the average U.S. temperature has been over time. So here we're looking at just the United States instead of some of these prior graphs looked at the whole planet. Well, if you ask that question, what was the history of U.S. temperature? In 1999, this is what you got. If you ask that same question, what's the history of U.S. temperature? It's the same question. This is what you got. And I've highlighted here, what's really the most remarkable difference between these two. In the 30s, according to our assessment in the 90s, in the 30s, it was significantly warmer at certain peaks in the period than the period more recently, including the large spike of the 98 El Nino. You look at other records, there's the number of heat index reports and other various anecdotal accounts very strongly support the idea of the 30s being a very, very hot, warm period. This, doesn't conform to the idea that we're currently in some runaway global warming crisis that we need to do something about. But as in 2006, the data was adjusted and reassessed, and lo and behold, actually the 30s were more on par with the recent period, if not a little bit cooler. And the overall average, more averaged trend, which you see in red, is now clearly shows that the 90s is significantly higher than what we had in the 30s, which is the opposite of what was presented before. Here the 90s are on par with the 30s, and then post 90s it goes up even more. So, in the context of everything we've gone through, these kinds of adjustments raise concerns. Here's a more detailed breakdown of, again, the history of U.S. temperature records, again, from 1880 up to 2010 here. So, this century plus of U.S. historical records. Here we're looking at what adjustments were made to those records between 2008 and 2015. So before we were looking at 99 to 2006. Now we can look at 2008 to 2015, the Obama administration period. And what we have here is not a measure of actual temperature. What we have here is the amount of change that was given to any individual historical record. So in the 30s, or in the 1900, 1910, 20, 30, in this whole period you had a systemic adjustment down of all of the records, even more so than what we already saw from 99 to 2006. All the historical records in this period, when looked at in 2008 versus 2015, by 2015, they had all been adjusted down as saying they were lower than we had thought in 2008. And anything in the more recent period has been adjusted up to say, actually the more recent period is even warmer than we thought it was in 2008. And if you take just a couple examples of particular months' records, just to illustrate this. So here we have January in 1915. So again, that's just one bar on this graph here. And again, what we see in this bar is how much the record was adjusted between 2008 and 2015. Well, here we have a blow-up of the continuous progression of those adjustments between 2008 and 2015. So you can see starting in 2008, they systemically, continually, on average, adjusted it lower, lower, lower. So this is just one slice, one example of this earlier period when, for all of these records, they were doing this kind of process. Then you take a more recent date, 2000, January 2000, and you can see between 2008 and 2012, they continually adjusted it higher and higher and higher. So these are just, blow-ups of particular slices of this graph. So again, this is ridiculous. If you want the warming trend as presented in a graph to the American people in a simplified, scary, way, well, if you make the past look cooler and the more recent period look warmer, you're going to get something that looks like a steeper warming trend. Can you trust this at all? You know, one of the most important things I think we have in this current, more recent period is, again, this satellite data. And then one other example of this kind of shoddy propaganda in the name of science is the famous hockey stick curve, which is the last one I want to cite, but it's, you know, doesn't get as much attention today, but is just as valid today as when it was exposed as a fraud years ago. This is now looking at the past 1,000 years of temperature records. So a longer stretch. Now you're getting into more what they call proxy records. You're looking at different processes with how trees grow, with how sediment, you know, different living processes record temperature, you know, various methods involved in trying to get some records that indicate how the temperature, what the temperature was and how it was changing year to year on a longer time scale. Now, the IPCC itself in 1990 had presented this as a generic graphic indicating what the temperature record was like over the past 1,000 years. They identified what was called the medieval warm period, and then what was called the Little Ice Age, and then the more recent period. So you see this, you immediately say, oh, climate tends to change a fair amount. And we have global warm periods and global and regional mini ice ages. You know, there's all kinds of anecdotal accounts and indications of how cold it was in Europe during this Little Ice Age, or how warm it was in Europe and Greenland in the medieval warm period. But you see this, it gives you one idea about how the climate tends to naturally vary, because obviously none of this is due to human activity going back the past 1,000 years, despite what some real crazy people try and claim. But then by 2001, the same IPCC presented the past 1,000 years of temperature variation like this, where that leads you to believe, oh, there's not as much general natural variation. There's some. It varies a little bit with this average trend, you know, in addition to the more radical year-to-year variations or shorter period variations. And then in the more recent period, it shot up, and it shot up in a way that it's never happened before in the past 1,000 years. That tells you something. That means that obviously something changed here and is different here, and therefore, you know, we got to look at what's the cause of that. Oh, it must be human CO2 activity because it's the only thing that's different. This graph allows you to make that argument. This graph doesn't. The problem was this graph was a total fraud. This graph was exposed as purely the product of the method of statistics used to combine the data. So again, you had a lot of different data sources, tree rings, various other things, and there's big questions about how do you combine all that? Do you just add it all up and divide it? What regions of the planet were you getting these records from? You know, how do you combine different regions of the planet? How do you combine different methods of getting temperature records? Those are big questions. They're not simple questions. But what was shown was that the method used to combine those would itself inherently, even if you gave it a completely random set of data, would produce exactly this trend. A general leveling out and averaging and flattening of past variations, and a spike up in the more recent period, looking like a hockey stick, the hockey stick curve. These are graphics reproduced. So these are what the IPCC had presented in 1990 versus 2001. These are reproductions from the paper that exposed this whole thing as a real fraud. And they showed that if you did a proper assessment of the data used to produce this graphic, and you didn't use this shoddy method that inherently would produce this hockey stick effect, the data looked like this. Right? Much closer to what the IPCC had said in 1990. That there is a lot more natural variation. The more recent period is not some unprecedented anomaly that has no precedent in historical records. This doesn't bring a cause for alarm. But then they applied this method of analysis, and it came out more like this. Again, a leveling off of the past, sharp increase in the future. And what this study did was they took an entire array of completely random data sets, put them in, and they all produced this same characteristic hockey stick curve. Still, despite the fact this was exposed in 2003, Al Gore in his movie, his fake news propaganda piece, presented the same character of, false depiction of the past 1,000 years of temperature. 3 years after this hockey stick was exposed as a fraud. Again, a leveling out, averaging of the past, dramatic shoot up in the recent period. Oh my God, what's causing that? It must be. And then people see the graph and they say, well, it's what the graph says. It must be true. It's total bunk. And you can see some more recent studies here, again, show, something much more consistent and in agreement with these earlier depictions of larger variation, not an indication that the present warming is anything unique or outside of natural variation. So this is demonstrated well. Anyway, so the point is just to, you look at this history of these types of adjustments and false depictions of the climate record, and you see this clear pattern of adjusting records, simplifying things, making scary and dramatic statements and presentations to the public, which fits the bill completely to what Margaret Mead laid out, what Schneider laid out as the way, quote-unquote, scientists have to act to fulfill their predefined objectives, and the objectives being defined to them of scaring the population into line behind this climate change scare. And as was stated and was clearly expressed at the 1975 launching of that conference, launching the whole focus on the atmosphere scare, and that this is really motivated, and the participants in it, and the key people, this is motivated fundamentally coming from this British Malthusian population reduction, really neo-eugenics, to a certain degree, neo-Nazi, or even more fundamental than Nazi, because this is the ideology that produced the Nazi movement. This is the ideology coming from the people that created the fascist movements in Italy, in Germany. This oligarchical Malthusian belief of mass population control is really what's motivated this entire process. So this new expose is excellent. It pulls the curtain on the internal workings of how some of this crap gets put out and how you have fake news, what is literally fake presentations of reality, presented in the name of science, and then people with the gall to say that anybody questioning that is a denier of science, when we just saw that the methods that went into producing this graph are nowhere near any basic fundamental standard of what real science actually is. So just to conclude on that point, we need real science. We need to stop denying science, and we need to start looking at some of the real frontier areas of the natural world and the relation of the planet to the solar system and to the galaxy, which do produce these natural variations in climate. Warming, cooling, ice ages, interglacial periods, snowball Earth periods. The planet has seen a lot. And CO2 is not the driving factor in determining that. There are many processes on Earth, ocean cycles, various things, plant life itself, life activity itself, which have significant effects, definitely. But many of those are subsumed by the relation of our planet to the solar system. Variations like this, variations in the activity of the sun itself, which is not constant, which itself goes through its own cycles and high levels of variation in its activity. And beyond that, looking at depiction of the Earth in the solar system, looking at certain explosive energetic outbursts from the sun, and the fact that these periodically encompass the Earth and change the conditions the Earth experiences. But even this subsumed by the solar system's relation in the galaxy. These are actual areas of frontier science, and they're being suppressed, they're being attacked, they're being denied by an ideologically motivated Malthusian movement that is not pursuing science, that even some of these supposed scientists, like the signer to this RICO letter, when pushed on the issues of science, fall back to ideology. And what's their ideology? It's what Margaret Mead said. It's what Schneider said. It's what Julian Huxley, Philip, Bernard said, that human growth is a scourge on the planet. Human beings are destroying the planet, and we need to rein in human population growth, even if it requires lying, scaring the crap out of people, and treating the mass population like ignorant peasants that are supposed to fall in line with the diktats presented in the name of science. So that needs to end. That needs to stop, and this new expose can be an important step in that process, but only if it's seen from this, exclusive, broader standpoint that we're presenting to you here now. This is the ideology behind it, and we have a much better opportunity before us with the kind of development and growth and population growth and economic development, infrastructure development, science development being led up by China and other nations, which goes completely the opposite way as this whole neo-Malthusian fraud, and will demonstrate once again that Malthus is wrong and will always be wrong, because for mankind there are no limits to growth other than the failure to progress scientifically and technologically. So I think we have a clear mission to return to that truly human mission and leave all of these Malthusians to the dustbin of history.